Hello and aloha, and welcome to History 241 Civilizations of Asia, Session 15, which deals with the Zhou Dynasty from about 1050 BC to 221 BC. Welcome aboard. My name is Abdul Karim Khan. Please note down my latest phone number as well as the email address. And should you need to contact me, please feel free to do it anytime, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Now, having said that, please also go to WebCT and check out the schedule, check out the assignments that might be coming up. So you need to do that, on an almost weekly or daily basis, not to, fall behind. So let's see what we have today. Today we would be talking about the Zhou Dynasty, which is the second dynasty in China, the Chinese history. But before we do that, we need to go and see what we did last time. That was also about the Chinese civilization and a sort of review. We talked about the geography of China, and then we focused on the three main geographical regions of China, like northern China, which was characterized by the Yellow River, and then the sort of middle tier of China, the geographical region which was characterized by the Yangtze River, and then the south of China that we talked about as being the very rich place in China. Then we started with the origins of the Chinese civilization, where it started much more, in the Chinese plains, northern Chinese plains, and the first dynasty, the Xia dynasty, or the state that this particular group of people, the Xia, established. Now, also, I said that the Xia dynasty, although mentioned, not only the dynasty, but its various kings mentioned with their dates, in the Chinese historical records, but unfortunately for a long time, the European or American scholars or the non-Chinese scholars of Chinese civilization did not recognize them or accept them. However, with much more excavations, now we know more about it. Then we also talked about the Shang dynasty. That would be the second dynasty after Xia, or the second state that was established in the Chinese history. And Shang dynasty, because of the great excavations and discoveries, it stands much more on firmer ground. There are a lot of proof about the Shang dynasty. It was during the Shang dynasty the oracle bones were, made, and we talked about the oracle bones, the function, of the oracles, and also related to the oracle bones, the rise of the Chinese writing. And we also said that, the Chinese writing that was used at that time also is, some of it, if not all, is used even this time. Until recent, time, it's still in business and in use, the Chinese characters that were used in the oracle bones. Now, from here onward, we would go into much more in historical periods. More writing you would see done about different kings or rulers or emperors, different regions that, came to power in China. So there you would see from now onward, that is about 1050 BC onward, much more writing being done. Speaking of writing about the Chinese civilization, that is one of the great things about the Chinese civilization, that there was so much writing done, and most of the writing related to basically history about the times and life and times of different several kings, and they had so many of them. Also writing related to poetry, another great thing about China. Some civilizations may not be known that much, like the Egyptian civilization. It was huge and big and very great, no question about that, but it did not produce as much writing in terms of history or literature or poetry or about the society as the Chinese did. So it's very writing, oriented civilization, very much history-oriented civilization, and again the Chinese people would jump back to prove their point, or the Chinese authors would go back to prove their point, go back to history to get legitimacy or sort of, a guide from history. So that's why it's very writing-oriented and history-oriented civilization, so keep that point in mind. Now, today we were going to be going into the Zhou Dynasty, the rise of the Zhou Dynasty. We will talk about that, the third dynasty in the history of China, and how this dynasty used the mandate of heaven, and we will talk about what is this mandate of heaven all about. Then we will talk about the legacy of the Western Zhou. This Zhou pronunciation, being non-Chinese could not be exact, so try to replace the ZH for J. So just like Zhou rather than Zhou. So try to replace it with J, the ZH. Eastern Zhou, that would be developed after the Western Zhou. We will talk about why this changed and how they became known. And then after the Eastern Zhou, or during the Eastern Zhou dynasty, the rise of the warring states and what they did to the rest of China. Okay. We would also talk about the overall Chinese religion and society that got developed during this period. So far the function of religion is concerned, religion being used for social purposes or religious purposes, keep that in mind, that also would start from the Zhou dynasty. So during the Zhou dynasty you would see a lot of things happening, and being not only just happening during that dynasty, this dynasty would also be used because it lived for long times, the dynasty, and ruled for long times, as we will see next. This dynasty would be used as a great historical justification, and this again and again in Chinese history, people would refer back to the good old days or the great days during the Zhou dynasty. So keep the importance of the Zhou dynasty as a great historical sort of a beginning, and we would see why it was so significant, so important in the history of China. Let's move further. Zhou dynasty, it ruled the longest. Its period was very long, 800 years. That's like ruling forever. Very long rule, the longest rule that it enjoyed in China. Also, during this period, the birth of philosophy in China, and the philosophical schools happened during this period. Now, there is something very unique, or I don't know to call it strange or what, that is, it was during the Zhou dynasty or the later period, the Eastern Zhou dynasty, that what you would see is the rise of these great philosophical schools in China. But that is not just only in China. Amazingly, the second half, or the Eastern Zhou or the later Zhou period, coincided not only with the rise of the great philosophers in China, but also in India, in Iran, that is Persia, in the Middle East, among the Hebrews, and further west, even in Greek, the Greek civilization. As if somebody told all these great philosophers to be born during this time. Now, the time period is somewhere, close to from about 700 BC to 200 BC. A little bit between 700, 500, the beginning period, and 200 BC, the ending period. So between 700 and 200 BC, what you see is the rise of all the ancient great philosophers within this period. Although it's a 500 long period, but amazingly then, around 500 BC, you see the birth of great philosophers. For example, let's start first with China. in China, close to 500 BC, you see the birth or the rise of the greatest philosopher of all times, Kung Tzu, Confucius, and Confucianism that would develop out of his teachings. Then about the same time, 100 years later, you see the rise of legalism, another major philosophy in China, and Taoism, another philosophy in China. All of them happening, close to this 500 BC period, or during the Eastern Zhou period. Now that was in China. Now in the same 500 BC period, close to that period, you see the rise of two great philosophical or religious personalities in India. Buddha and Mahavira were born almost exactly the same time that Confucius was born in China. Buddha and Mahavira in India. Then exactly the same time, or close to the same time, you see the birth of the great king in Persia or Iran, Cyrus the Great, that is mentioned in the Old Testament. The birth of the Persian prophet called Zarathustra, or Zoroaster in English. He was born also close to this time period. Now moving further west, close to the same time, you see the birth of Prophet Isaiah. This is the second Isaiah, not the first one. Prophet Isaiah mentioned in the Old Testament the rise of this great wonderful person among the Hebrews, in ancient Palestine. Then moving further west towards Greece, among the Greek people, you see the rise of almost the same time, the rise of the great philosopher Socrates, and after him, Plato, and after him, Aristotle, who was the tutor of Alexander the Great. So all these great personalities first being born close to around 500 BC, or in between 500 BC and 200 BC. So that's why in history this is the greatest chance coincidence, and historians treat this period as a very significant period, and that period in China is the period of the Zhou Dynasty, or the Eastern or the later Zhou Dynasty. Let's move further. So the Zhou Dynasty is divided into two major periods. One is the early or the Western Zhou Dynasty period, which stretches from 1046 BC to 771 BC. Then the second period is that of the later or the Eastern Zhou period, which stretches from 770 BC to 256 BC. Now it was during the later or the Eastern Zhou period that you see two other major periods. One is the Spring and Autumn period. It's called the Spring and Autumn period because during this time a book was written about this time period a little later on. So that's why this whole period from 770 BC to 476 BC is referred to as the Spring and Autumn, because a book by that title was written about this period. And then from about 476 to 221 BC, this period is referred to as the Warring State period. There were so many states that we would go into, refer to them, these warring states, and that warring states period would bring down the Zhou Dynasty because there was too much warfare, too much disturbance. That great peace period that, lived for so long, that peace would be broken into pieces. And so people would not be able to do agricultural activity. They would not be able to do commercial activity, trade and business, and life would be brought to stand still. And so this period, the Warring State period, would give birth to the rise of a very great personality in China, an emperor. That emperor would establish a great, empire, the first Chinese empire, and we will see, all that exciting stuff later on. So let's see first, move on into the Zhou Dynasty. The first period, the Western Zhou Dynasty, the rise of the Zhou people and their state and their family in the Wei Valley. Now keep in mind, this Zhou people These were the subordinates of the Shang people, the Shang dynasty, that the second dynasty that went before them, Zhou dynasty being the third, as I said. So the Zhou people, they were under the command of the Shang people. So let's see their historical place, their area. This is the Wei River or River Wei, moving from west to east, and in the east, if I could, right here, it meets up with the Yellow River that rises from here, goes north and then east and then south and then east. So here at this southeastern bend of the Yellow River, the Wei River meets up right there. And so this family, the Zhou people, they came into power and they established themselves in this valley. And as they came into power, they created their own capital, the capital of Hao, right there on the River Wei. So keep in mind, this is referred to as the Western Zhou because they are living in the western side of this area. Then they would move to the east later on, and that's why they would be called the Eastern people. Okay, let's see. I just wanted to show you the map of China. This is the map of China, and the the rise of the Zhou people in the west, and that's why it's called the Western Zhou period, with their capital Hao. And when they move from here to there to this area, then they would be called the Eastern Zhou people with their brand new capital. All right, so it was during this period and this area that the Shang people, they had been ruling, the Shang people had been ruling there, and their rule was becoming very unpopular. And the reason for that being that the last Shang king, they became a little bit brutal with the people, with their own people. And so people became sick and tired of them, and that's how the one Zhou prince, who later on would become known as Wu, and so we would later on refer to him as Wu Wang, W-A-N-G, and sometimes the two words are written, together. So this Zhou prince, later to be known, as I said, as King Wu, he rose against the Shang rule, and he could not do it himself. So he organized, put together an anti-Shang force of non-Shang people in the region. So he invited other non-Shang local landlords to bring their forces, and let's fight together against this brutal, Shang ruler or Shang king. So that's how, keep in mind, the Zhou could not do it themselves. They had to have the support of other people, and this would be, a major point in how the Zhou would rule. So together, these people under the leadership of King Wu, the Zhou prince, they defeated the last Shang king Di Xian in the Battle of Muye in 1046 BC. Now there is a great battle, in a place called Muye in 1046 BC. All this was mentioned in the chronicles or the traditional history of China. But unfortunately, the non-Chinese scholars of Chinese civilization, like American scholars and European scholars, they did not believe in all this stuff. But now, thanks to, as I said, to major excavations and discoveries, now they think, yes, the Zhou dynasty, whatever it did, and now this is the proof what they did. So that's why it's important to remember that some of these dates, 1046, these were very controversial. Other scholars did not believe in it because they couldn't find the proof for it. And so now the proof is coming more and more with different, scientific excavation and archaeology. As archaeology gets more and more scientific, the carbon dating system, that, becomes a firmer ground for history. Okay, let's see further. So the Zhou people, with the help of other people, they destroyed the Shang capital at Anyang. Now, why did they destroy this capital? When they killed, the Shang people, Why did they destroy the capital at Anyang? And the reason for that is very simple. In Chinese history and later on in other, civilization, capital is always a symbol of the power of the people that rule in that area. And since Anyang was the capital of the Shang people, that's why the Zhou people had to destroy it, which meant it's sort of, this capital being the symbol of the Shang people. So with the destruction of the capital that symbolized the destruction of the Shang people, they would never come back in history to rule the place. They would never be able to form another capital, and bring their people together. And so capital always means the strength of the dynasty or the people. It also means the strength of their power. And so that's why the capital had to be, destroyed. Let's see further. Now, the Zhou Dynasty, the way they put together their state and government, that is called Zhou Feudalism. And let's see what is this Zhou Feudalism, or what was it? The Zhou king, they seized Shang lands, all the lands that belonged to the Shang people or their supporters. And so they took, the Zhou kings, they took that land of the Shang and redistributed it among their own family members and their loyal supporters, because they did not win this war in 1046 at Muye against the Shang people. They had to have the support of other people. And so now they had to give reward to their supporters, and that's how they gave them estates, land, huge and big in different places. And so their supporters would become, landlords. And that landlord is called feudal lord, or the rule of the feudal lords, as it's called feudalism. It's also called landlordism. So the Zhou kings created a feudal style of hereditary landlordism or landlords. So hereditary in the sense that the person now who owned this land, he would give it to later on to his son, who would pass it on to his son, the grandson. And that is how the land would stay in the family, within the family. And technically, the land really did not belong to the family. It belonged to the king who had given it to them in the first instance, or to their forefathers. So the land technically belonged to the royal family, in this case, the Zhou family. However, this family, the landlord family, would become so strong that for the king, it would be just impossible to take it away from them and give it to somebody else. There would be different reasons. We would see that. Normally what happened was that the landlord family, the feudal family that would create its own state, within China, would be very loyal to the king. So the king did not feel the need, to take the land from them. They would be very supportive of the king. So that's why the king would not disturb, their rule in the region, and he would let the land to stay in the family. And it would be very clear to the family that the land belongs to the king. He could take it, away from them and give it to somebody else anytime he wanted. So they had to be very loyal, supportive, subordinate, and do whatever the king would want. That is called feudalism. So feudalism is a sort of political and economic relationship between the king at the center and the different states or the families in the provinces or the states out there in the, in the outlying regions. So if this relationship, when this breaks down, meaning either the king does not like the families or the landlords, or the landlords, they don't like, the king, there would be a problem, and so feudalism would break down, or the relationship between the two would break down, and there would be a lot of problems. Let's see further. Also, the Zhou king, they adopted this theory of mandate of heaven from the Shang people, but then they used it to justify the overthrow of the Shang through the same mandate of heaven. And we would explain that later on, what it means. So keep in mind, the mandate of heaven did not originate with the Shang people. With the Zhou people. It already existed among the Shang people, and they used it for religious purposes, but the Zhou king, they used it for political purposes. So they justified the overthrow of the Shang people through the mandate of heaven. Let's see further. What is this mandate of heaven? Referred to in Chinese as Tianming, mandate or authority from heaven. And heaven being loosely translated in English as God, if there is. In fact, the early or the ancient Chinese did not believe in God in the sense that Christians or Muslims or Jews would believe in a God, but they would refer to him as heaven, high above, an authority. But they believed that there was a higher supreme being who, manage things not only in the heavens but also on earth. Hence, the mandate of heaven or the authority from heaven or from God. Now, that heaven or God, he appoints kings. That's the theory. He appoints kings. The kings or the dynasty does not come into power on its own. The God or that heaven appoints them and brings them into power. And they would have to, the kings, they would have to rule morally, according to the mandate or authority of God or heaven. They would have to be good, to be moral people. And they would have to take care of the people, the state or the business of the state or the business of the people. Taking care of people in Chinese history or Chinese civilization, it meant that the king must spend his money or authority for the sake of the people. So he should take care of agriculture, he should take care of irrigation and the canals and all that, and he should be good. And he should be good as like a father, just as the father has to take care of his family, to provide with the food, the morality of the family, and the prestige of the family. Similarly, the king has to be good to his people, provide for them, keep them in good status, economic and moral status, and then only then he would be able to obey or abide by the mandate of heaven. If not, let's see what would happen. If he does not obey the mandate or does not live according to the mandate that is ruling morally and taking care of the people, then God or heaven would take away that mandate, that authority, that power from him, from the corrupt kings, and would give it to somebody else. And that is how the bad kings are replaced with good kings in the history of China. And so this mandate of heaven, that it not only justifies to overthrow the bad or the corrupt kings, but to bring good kings in power. All right. So this justification of the overthrow of corrupt rulers and corrupt dynasties, that comes from the mandate of heaven as it was practiced in the Zhou Dynasty. As I said, it insists on the morality of the ruler, that the ruler must be, the king or the emperor must be a moral person. So his rule is based on morality, not on the nobility of his family or not on his birth in a noble family. What it means, through the mandate of heaven, any person who is good can become a ruler because he has that authority from God or from heaven. So as long as he lives, in a moral way and he takes care of the people, that is great, and he would stay in power. So for the mandate of heaven, one does not have to be born in a king or a royal family, even though it happened. The king's son followed him and the son was followed by the grandson and all that. But they remained morally good and took care of the people, so that's why they stay in power. But in China also, at the same time, non-royal family or non-king, family, they also came into power. People from the peasant families, very poor people, but capable people, talented people, they came into power because they were morally good people. They realized that they need to take care of the people, the state and the country. So that's why they came into power. So they did not have to be born in a noble family. Noble family meaning to be born in the king's family, or to be born in a great bureaucrat family, or to be born in a higher status family. One could be born in the peasant family and could be perfect, later on could become a perfect king under the mandate of heaven. So this was good, because in India you had to be born in the certain caste to become a king or a ruler or a priest. But in China, one could be born in any place in the society, in any section of the society, and could become the king or the emperor of China. Let's see further. So that's the insistence on morality, not on the nobility of the person. Mandate of heaven also gives moral support to good rulers who would connect, or the ruler who connects the earth with heaven. Meaning that heaven is above, earth is below, and the king is right in the middle. So when he is good, he connects the earth with heaven, and so everything is in good order. That's what it means. So he has a big responsibility to perform. Now this king and his mandate from heaven, there is a sort of relationship between the two, the king and heaven relationship, and it works, as I said, the mandate worked as long as the king, who was referred to from, the Zhou Dynasty onward as the son of heaven. As long as the son of heaven ruled morally, he took care of the people, he would keep the mandate with him. He would have that authority from God or heaven, and he would, or his family would, live long and rule long. However, if the king did not rule morally, did not take care of the people, just like in the Western Zhou king, King Li, later on to be referred to as Li Wang, he lost this mandate of heaven. Why? Because he became very oppressive person, debauch. He was much more interested in pleasure and of the flesh and drinking, rather than taking care of the business of the people. So in 841, he lost this mandate because he was kicked out of business. Now, speaking of 841 BC, most historians believe that this was a very important date, and the real date, 841 BC, a real date in the history of China. The reason for that being, it was an important date, and from now onward, the dating system in China would be very regular. From 841 BC, before 841 BC, there could be some problems with the dating system. Somehow, from 841, after King Li or Li Wang, the dating system would be perfect, sort of, one could refer to exact events, one could refer to exact battles, or the life and time of different rulers and kings. So 841, which is very early time, 841 BC, that is 141 years before the birth of Christ. So keep in mind 841 BC, an important date in the history of China. All right, let's move further. During this period, this King Li or Li Wang, he lost the help of his people, because he lost the mandate of heaven, and his own landlords, they drew him out from his capital and from throne. However, they brought one of his sons to the throne, so it's not the end of the dynasty completely. Okay, let's see the legacy of the Western Zhou, what happened during this dynasty. This came to an end with the King Li. Zhou Dynasty, in fact, it continued the Shang Dynasty. The 500 years old Shang culture merged into the Zhou culture and continued on and further developed. So the Zhou dynasty, its significance is that it continued the Shang rule of 500 years, long. It did adopt Shang religious ideas like, heaven or the son of heaven or God, and that heaven or God being the creator of the universe. It adopted the religious ideas from the Shang dynasty, as it happened in so many other cultures. However, it turned this idea, political idea, into a this religious idea into a political idea, in the sense that the son of heaven was not just the son of heaven, in the religious sense, but he was also the son of heaven in the political sense, because he had to now obey heaven politically, taking care of the state, taking care of the people economically, socially, politically, religiously. Previously, he was just, it was great for him that he performed certain rituals. He performed certain sacrifices, animal or human or whatever. So his sense of being the son of heaven was much more in the religious sense, in the spiritual sense. But now in the Zhou dynasty, that was not enough to be a priest or higher priest, or to be a person just performing, religious rituals. Now he had to do the real job, and that was to take care of the people and the state and the country, and protect it and keep it in peace, keep it in prosperity, protect it from foreign invasions, or at least the invasions of the Mongol people. So that's why the Son of Heaven became much more a political philosophy in the person of the king. So if the king was not a good king and not a good son of heaven, the son would be displeased with him and would take the authority from him or his family and give it to somebody else and some other family. All right, let's see further. The legacy of the Zhou dynasty, Western Zhou dynasty, it continued and developed the Shang material culture. That is like irrigation, pots and pottery and other material stuff. It was very peaceful, the Zhou dynasty, and that peace made prosperity possible. And so what you see, people much more focused on agriculture and commerce and trade and business, and would have great material life. Need more for material items. As there were a lot of peace, a lot of prosperity, more people needed more material items, and more material items would be definitely created. So this material culture was important during the Western Zhou. Also, the Western Zhou people, they refined the earthenware or the pots and pans of the Shang dynasty. So that was also important. So you would see much more refined, not only earthenware, but also furniture, road construction, irrigation. Most of that material culture of the Shang would be refined during the Zhou dynasty. It is during this Western Zhou time that China gained world fame for being the place to produce so beautiful porcelain and jade products. As China later on, in 18th century AD, and 19th century AD would become so much, in the world known as for porcelain and jade products. In fact, that was in the Western Zhou time. It was already making all this great stuff, but that great stuff did not find, outside a great market. It was only based inside China. This trade in base and all this production, beautiful production, only in China. It did not get out of China, not yet. So pretty soon, all that stuff that was made in China and developed and created in China would find market outside China, in Persia, in Central Asia, in Rome, in Greece, in India and Europe, and become very much known. So this is the beginning of the Chinese civilization becoming known for the jade products and the porcelain products. Let's see further. This pot is basically from the Shang dynasty, but this would become much more beautiful, later on, with the continuation of the Zhou dynasty. This is the middle period between the Shang and the Zhou dynasty. It doesn't look that great right now, but later on it would become very beautiful. Because of all these copyrights things, we cannot show you everything. Let's see further. Bronze and iron and jade tools would be made. Beautiful stuff, beautiful stuff. Bronze and iron and jade tools. And these, tools or these products would be exchanged. These were beautifully decorative. Bronze vessels would be exchanged between the kings and the vassals. Vassals being the landlords. Kings and vassals, kings and his landlords. The two terms pronounce almost the same thing. Vessels, these are items, parts, and drinking parts, for example, and this vessel, that means landlords. Although the spelling is almost the same, the pronunciation is almost the same. So it's good to have it right here, the two together, and so that you would know what which one means what. So bronze vessels meaning parts and pottery, and this other kings and vassals, kings and landlords. So they would exchange. If you wanted to give someone gift to the king or to your friend, you would give them these beautiful items made out of bronze or jade, and that's how people would exchange gifts with each other, and then they would become items for commerce and trade, not only within China but also outside China. Let's see further. These items, some of them, those especially made of bronze and jade, they were made for religious purposes. So items for religious rituals or purposes were made out of bronze and jade. On the other hand, weapons were made out of iron. So those things, the items that were made out of iron, they were made either for warfare or for irrigation and agriculture purpose, because as you know, that these items, iron being very strong compared to bronze and jade, so that's why iron made stuff would be used in weapons, in warfare and irrigation and agriculture purposes. Okay, let's see some of this material. Here are the wine jars. This one, and that you can see, this one is much more from a late Shang period, and this is from early Western Zhou period, and you see this much more beautiful and with a lot of decoration. And I rather have this one rather than that one. I don't know about you, which one you like. So this is the early period, and this is a later product of a later Zhou, Western Zhou period, and you see the difference between the two and the refinement and the symbols that were written on them, and that's how things developed in China. These are the wine jars. Here you see ritual bronze vessel that the kings and the nobility used, and you see a lot of this is bronze, but a lot of inlaid work done in here, and later on you would see a lot more writing, very beautiful calligraphic writing on the bronze. Here's another ritual object made out of jade. This is still debated, why in this particular, object, this hole was created and left open. What was the purpose? Still, there is a debate on that, and you can find out on your own, do your own research to find out why these holes were left in the center. What was the purpose of that? You would see not only this, but different other hundreds and thousands of these objects, exactly the same shape, or if not size, but the same hole. All right. Here is a jade burial suit. If a king, of course, only the kings and the nobles, the high or the rich people, they could afford, and this is the, not only just, maybe in China, the first use of jade for burial purposes. But also later on we see the use of jade in the Native Americans. but that's very late, hundreds and thousands of years later, Native Americans would adopt the same thing from, I don't know if they really adopted from the Chinese, but keep in mind also that the Native Americans were very much related to, the Chinese, the Mongol people or the Mongolite people, that could be that they adopted from the Chinese. All right. Moving further on, jade, and this is the jade, stone, and these are the buttons. They could make anything out of jade, very expensive stuff and very beautiful stuff, jade buttons. This whole technology and the use of jade, keep in mind, coming out of China, not just the silk and the porcelain, but also jade, and much more talked about and written about in Chinese civilization. All right, during the Western Zhou, you see the rise of the cities, internal trade and commerce going on, and creating, the creation of the commercial culture. Trade was confined to North China because that was the historical place of the Zhou Dynasty and the Xie Dynasty and now the Zhou Dynasty. It was home to several states, northern China, and that's why there were a lot more people living there and a lot more trade and business went there. Most of this trade and business was originally, agriculture between the Yellow and the Yangtze River. So much more agriculture, trade and business going on in China and northern China. However, this agriculture once developed, in northern China would go to south, and then you would see the agricultural items being traded and taken from the north to south. And so what would happen, the northern people who were always stuck up with the barley or wheat, now they would be able to enjoy the rice from the south. And similarly, those people who felt, that rice was boring because they ate nothing but rice, now they would enjoy, wheat from the north. So this north and south, wheat and rice exchange, trade or commercial exchange would happen, pretty soon. So starting from the Zhou Dynasty, you see that, okay. The reason I said that this trade was confined to North China because that's where, the original homeland of the rise of these great families or the ruling families happened. A lot of states were born right there in this area between the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the middle or the south of China. Let's see further. The end of the Western Zhou, it happened because barbarians from the north, much more Mongol people, they invaded China, which is gonna be, going to be a chronic problem in the history of China. So in 771 BC, the Western Zhou people, they could not stand the invasion by the barbarian kings, and their king Yu or Yu Wang, he was killed by the barbarians. There is a story behind King Yu's being killed, and the reason was that he lost the support of his queen's father, that is his father-in-law, and his father-in-law joined hands with these barbarians. Now, why a father-in-law would do that to his son-in-law? Well, the reason is believed to be that the king, he somehow did not like his queen. And so he left his queen for a concubine. Now, keep in mind, China, in ancient times, now it's okay a little bit, in ancient time it was very polygamous. Even if he had, 4 or 5 queens, he would also have on the side these different concubines, and sometimes these concubines would be very powerful women, very talented women, and they would manipulate, political, strings from behind the scene, and that's how it, would cause trouble to the king or to the dynasty, and that's how this king lost his head, and his life, because he switched his loyalties from his queen to a concubine. Now, this queen also came from a very powerful family, who had the support of other people, And so her family, her father, the queen's father, he went and joined hands with the barbarians, and that's how he was killed. The story is that his bodyguard did not guard him, and they let the barbarian come into his palace, and he was killed right there in his palace. So he was taught, in a way, a good lesson by his father-in-law: do not leave your queen for a concubine. Okay, let's move on. The barbarians, they occupied the Wei Valley, which was, as you know, the home and the birthplace of the Zhou Dynasty. Okay, the father-in-law, he played his hand, maybe too much. So this family, the Western Zhou family, it was wiped out by the barbarians, and they lost the Wei Valley to the barbarian people. Landlords, those who were still loyal to the Zhou Dynasty, they restored the Zhou rule. They were still loyal to the Zhou people, although they did not like that one King Yu. And so they supported and enthroned a Zhou heir to the throne in about 827 BC. So they brought another person to the throne, a Zhou person to the throne. More landlords now, because the Western Zhou came under, the fire of the barbarians, more landlords now felt free from the Zhou dynastic domination. They believed that they could become free, and they didn't have to obey always a Zhou king, especially a Zhou king who was, corrupt and who did not have the support of his family. So there you see the landlords becoming much more powerful. Western Zhou became weakened because of the barbarians from the north against whom they had to fight, and the internal division that were going to start inside China. So keep in mind two things that would, be repeated in the history of China: northern invasion, that is invasion by the barbarians from the north, especially Mongols, and or the western part of China, and the internal divisions within China, that different states would collide or invade each other, that would ruin the dynasty and its chances to keep itself in power. Let's see further. So Western Zhou becoming weak. In about 771 BC, the Zhou people, they moved the capital from west to east because the west was not safe. It was occupied by other people, barbarians. So they moved the capital from Hao to Luoyang, that is in the east. And there is Hao, the western, Zhou place, and from Hao it moved to further east. There it is, Luoyang. And now here in the east, much more better agricultural place came under the hands of the Zhou family or the Zhou dynasty. So now, from now onward, we would be talking of Eastern Zhou, not Western Zhou. And this is the difference between the two: the Western Zhou, or the early period of the Zhou dynasty, and the Eastern Zhou, which is the later period of the Zhou dynasty. Let's see further. Eastern Zhou now. It came into being about 770 BC. Eastern Zhou period started during that period, 770 BC, with the moving of the capital. Western Zhou, in fact, merged and continued the Eastern Zhou culture. So keep in mind, this Western Zhou is not a new family or new dynasty. It is just the continuation of the same family, the same dynasty, and it took with itself the Eastern Zhou culture and continued it and made it, a little bit developed. No major political changes the way they ruled. The same feudal state and feudalism would be in power. However, the socio-economic developments happened rather, slowly but surely. It happened much more because now eastern area is much more agriculture and much more safer compared to the western part that the Western Zhou people lived in. So that's why you would see much more socio-economic developments during the Eastern Zhou time. Right. The provincial vassal states, that is the landlord states, they also grew in economic power at the cost of the Zhou kings. So this is now, as I told you, this is going to be a chronic problem in the history of China, that the states, the provinces, the vassals, they would become much more powerful at the cost of the king at the center. These vassal states, they maintained their own armies. They were well equipped. They provided them with weapons, and so they could become a threat to the king at the center. That, in fact, whether they would become a threat to the king in the center or not, they became threat to each other. So there would be much more warfare among these vassal states, and that would ruin, China. It would ruin the products of China, agriculture or commerce. So let's see some of these warring states that developed during the Eastern Zhou time. The Chu state, the Qi, Han, Yan, Wei, Zhao, and the Qin. Now the Qin won the most powerful, and we will see why, what it did. There are the places. This is the Qin, living in the West. And here is Chu, Han, Wei, Zhao, Yan, and Qi. The Q is pronounced in the pinyin system as CH. So this is Qi, and this is Qin. Different warring states. I think I eliminated one or two. Many more smaller ones, but these were the major ones, and so that's why they're called the warring states, that would start fighting among themselves from about 480 BC to 221 BC. And these ones living in about northeast area, they would wipe each other out. They would weaken each other out. And finally, this one, the Qin that waited in the west, they would come and take all of them. And the Qin people would unite all this China that we have. Present day China, in fact, was unified by the Qin. All of them would be wiped out into and merged into one China under the Qin rule. This would be the Qin dynasty that would give us the Great Chinese Wall to protect China in the north from Mongolia, which is right here, from the Mongol people. Let's see further. Some of these powerful states attacked each other or conquered the weaker ones, and that, no two states ever lived in peace. So there you see in China also. This is the time that each state produced its own first noble or dukes. So the duke would be the ruler, in each state. It's a modern terminology, European terminology called the dukes, but the term that is used is loosely translated in Chinese as the first nobles. So you see from now onward, the rule of the first nobles are the dukes in each state. This would also lead to the rise of the warrior class, because warfare becoming much more common, and so they need to have a warrior class. Also, because of their fighting among themselves, there would be general socio-political chaos, which of course would, ruin the economy. So the economic prosperity that was so much, the characteristic of the Zhou dynasty, that would be broken into pieces. That peace and prosperity, economic prosperity, political stability, that would be broken into pieces because of all these warring states fighting, from 480 BC onward up to 221 BC. So this is like fighting, for almost 300-400 years, and that would, of course, ruin the economy and the political unity of China. Later on, somebody would definitely rise, and would wipe out all these warring states, and the fighting would come to an end, and China would be unified, as I said, under the Qin dynasty. Let's see further. Chinese religion, as it was established during the Zhou dynasty, became much more crystallized, very clear, what religion meant during this time. So in the Zhou dynasty period, there is time and again this reference to God, God of the soil or God of the land on earth that was created by this God, and he is being the creator of the universe. So he was worshipped by kings and nobles, just like in the Zhou Dynasty, but now he would be also much more worshipped by other people. The social political groups, rituals, would be what it means that this God would be worshipped by in groups, and these groups, even of the common people, they would be led by the kings or their local landlords or their local noble people, the local rulers. They would worship God, and they would worship it also on behalf of the people. So there what you see is the worship of God by the king or by the local landlord or by the local ruler, being like sort of a high priest of the village or of the state. So common people, they did not have to worship God. So God is still in China was not a personal God for each and every person in the China, in the dynasty or in the country. He was the God to be worshipped and to be reached out or to be accessed by the king or by the local landlord or by the local ruler on behalf of the people. So it would be group type of a ritual, but at the same time it would be much more led by the king and the rulers, the local rulers. So not individual rule, this worship and this relationship with God would not be so much individual or personalized. It would be a group activity to be led by the king, to be led by the local landlord or ruler. Let's see further. Also, during the same period, you see the worship of the ancestral spirits by kings and nobles, and later on by rich people, not by the poor people so much, although it would have impact on the poor people, common people, and they would also have their own ancestral worship of their ancestral spirits. Let's see further. Temples were created to God on high, as he is referred to. And these were centers of the rituals where the royal family and the noble families would go and offer sacrifices to God. So you see the rise of the temples too, made to God by the kings and great rich people. Prayers and sacrifices were offered for economic prosperity, as it happens in any culture, any civilization. And conquerors, they would destroy the temples or the shrines of the previous dynasty or the previous rulers. So once their temples were destroyed, that meant like as if their gods were destroyed, or their relationship with the god was destroyed because the temple was destroyed. This is something like, as I said, the capital had to be destroyed because capital stood for this, a symbol of the power of the family or the dynasty. So that once that capital was destroyed, it meant that their power was destroyed. Now, in this case, the temple also was destroyed because it meant the destruction between the heaven or the heaven and this bad son of heaven. So they lost the power, and so that's why they were wiped out. And their shrines and temples were also wiped out. Let's see further. Chinese society. Well, of course, like in any society, the rulers and the royalty at the top, then the noble class, like in so many other places. And these nobles were referred to as the first nobles or the dukes. And these were the heads of their petty small states, always fighting among themselves. The nobility also had the warrior class and the bureaucrats, those who, managed China or controlled China, and warriors. Also, in China, just like in any other culture, but maybe much more in China, you see the rise of the scholars during the Zhou Dynasty, the writers and the poets. So these would be also considered like a separate class, the scholars, the writers and the poets, and they would have their own status in the society. Okay, common people and free people, a lot of them in China. Most of them were small landlords, and some of them were, landless people. landless peasants. Most of them engage in agricultural activity. Also, they would be traders and craftsmen. Now, keep this order in mind. First the royalty, then the nobility, then the common people, and among the common people, the landowners or the landless peasants, and then at the bottom would be the traders and the craftsmen, and then the slaves. Now, this order is important because agricultural people, peasants or landowners, they were given priority. Then the second group would be the traders and the craftsmen, those who made things or traded things, and then the slaves. However, in China, chances for upward mobility, social economic mobility, were higher than in India. And the reason for that was that China did not have a caste system. So that was good thing about China, that you could change your status. You could change your status even if a person was born in a very poor family, peasant family, but he was not always tied, or she was not always tied to the poor peasant family. With talent, with opportunity, they could move from landless to land-owning family, and from the land-owning family, some of them, if not all of them, of course, some of them could become scholars, businessmen. Some of them could engage in trade and business. Some of them could become bureaucrats or even kings. So compared to India or Europe, China had much more higher opportunities for low-income people to become, higher income people, to change their status. It was very good in China, and this type of opportunity didn't have, because in India you were born in a particular caste and you were stuck up to the profession of that caste, untouchables, Shudra, or these Kshatriya people, or the Brahman people, or the Vaishya people. This type of a rigid caste system did not operate in China, and that was good for the Chinese people to move from the very low to even to the top of, economic and political opportunities in China. Let's see further. Chinese philosophy. During the Zhou Dynasty, you see the rise of the 100 schools of thoughts. The 100 schools of thoughts, and these thoughts, these were basically philosophies. And these philosophies, like Confucianism, legalism, Taoism, these great philosophical schools would be born in China. Now, as I said in the beginning of this session 15, China would be not just becoming known in the world, not for only these great material products like jade or porcelain or silk. These were wonderful stuff, no question about that. But at the same time, China would become known for philosophies, different philosophical schools, as we would see, in the next session, how these schools operated and how they influenced people. Some of the schools, like Confucianism, they were both for the royal family as well as for the common people. Legalism was much more for the rulers, but not for the ruled or the subject people. Taoism was not for everybody. It was only meant for a few people. Later on, though, a lot of people joined them. So different philosophies and different thoughts for different people of the society in China. Some of them meant for everybody, some of them meant only for, a few people, like the rulers and the nobles, the ruling class people. So China would be known as a great philosophical civilization. Just like now we know more about, the Greek philosophy, right? Greek, when we say Greek civilization, our mind, jumps to Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Also for great literature, poetry, drama, Roman civilization being known for law, government, Roman army, not for any other thing but great architectural designs, buildings. The Egyptian civilization known for, pyramids, the river Nile Valley and products. The Chinese would be known for all this great stuff. The agricultural products, philosophical mind, also the Great Wall of China and major products and major architectural designs, major sort of projects, the digging of the canals between the Yangtze River in the north and, the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south to dig up a canal and to connect the two. This project, whether dynasties could do it or not, that's the second thing, but to have that type of a, mega thought of a project for the state, for the country to do, better agriculture and let people have peace and prosperity and abundance of food and agricultural products and peace and economic activity, that would be, a major thought and a major activity in the Chinese civilization. And this even still continues to do things on a great major scale. That would be the Chinese mind. So let's see further what we did today. Well, we focused on the origins of the Zhou Dynasty, how it ruled and what it did. First, beginning with the Western Zhou and then moving to the Eastern Zhou, and they're coming into being under, the justification under the mandate of heaven, how they use this, religious philosophy for political, justification. The material development under the Zhou Dynasty, which continued basically the Shang Dynasty and developed it, and how they moved the capital and why they moved the capital from west to the east, and the religious crystallization in China and the social development in China. So these were the basic, features of the Zhou Dynasty, and next session we would focus on the philosophies of China that happened under the Zhou Dynasty. And thank you very much for tuning in. Aloha.